You're sitting on the couch at the end of a long day, and your dog walks over and starts licking your hand. Most people assume it's about taste, the salt on your skin, or just a habit they never outgrew. But behavioral neuroscience tells a completely different story. What your dog does every time they lick you is not random. It's a multi-layered language, part submission, part stress chemistry, part emotional intelligence, built across 15,000 years of evolution. And researchers have found something most owners genuinely don't expect. Your dog licks you more when you're struggling. They know. And most dog owners spend their entire lives misreading every single one of those licks. Before your dog ever met you, licking was already encoded into their behavior as a survival signal. In wolf packs, young cubs lick the mouths of returning adults, not as a greeting, but as a request for food and protection. They're communicating something very specific. I am small, I am not a threat, I trust you to take care of me. That impulse didn't disappear when wolves became dogs over 15,000 years ago. It transferred, and the target became you. When your dog licks your hand after you walk through the door, part of what they're expressing is trust. Not affection first. Trust first. The kind that says, you're the one I have chosen to be safe with. Researchers who study allogrooming, mutual grooming behavior in bonded social mammals, found a consistent pattern across dozens of species. Social animals groom the individuals they feel attached to. The ones they've decided are worth staying near. The ones whose presence lowers their anxiety. Dogs do the same. They just don't have hands. So they use their tongues, and they have been doing it this way for a long time. Every lick is a relationship signal. It says, I see you, I chose you, and I am still here. There's also a social hierarchy signal embedded in licking that most people never stop to consider. In canine social groups, lower-ranking animals lick higher-ranking ones, not out of fear, but out of genuine acknowledgement and deference. When your dog licks you, they are placing you, consciously or not, at the center of their social world. They're not being dramatic. They are telling you, in the clearest way they know, exactly where you sit in their life. This isn't sentiment. It's 15,000 years of social wiring showing up quietly in your living room every single day. And the remarkable thing is that your dog doesn't reason through any of this. It simply moves through them the way breathing does. The trust, the recognition, the bond, it all travels through the body before it ever reaches anything like thought. But this is only the first layer of what a lick actually means. Because your dog isn't just sending you a signal when they lick you. They're also doing something for themselves at the exact same time. And that's where the neuroscience comes in. The reason your dog licks you after a hard day goes deeper than communication. It's also about what licking does to their own brain. Every time a dog performs a repetitive, rhythmic behavior, licking, nuzzling, grooming, their brain releases dopamine and endorphins. Licking is a self-soothing mechanism. The act isn't just a message sent outward. It's also internal regulation for the dog performing it. Researchers studying stress responses in domestic dogs found that cortisol, the primary stress hormone, drops measurably after a sustained licking episode. Your dog isn't just trying to comfort you. They are using the physical act of licking you to calm their own nervous system down. When your dog senses something is off in the house, in you, in the air, they come to you and lick. They're not just responding to your stress. They are managing their own at the exact same time. This is what behaviorists call a self-reinforcing loop. The licking feels regulating, so the dog does it more. The more they do it, the more their anxiety settles. But what separates this from simple habit is where the licking is directed. It isn't random. It's toward you specifically. Your dog doesn't lick the wall or the floor when they're anxious. They seek you out to perform this behavior with. That distinction matters enormously. That choice to find you, to lick you, to repeat the motion near you, is a sign of attachment, not just instinct. Behavioral scientists call this proximity seeking under stress. And it mirrors almost exactly what human infants do when they're overwhelmed. They turn toward their primary caregiver. Your dog does the same. They turn toward the one presence that helps their nervous system feel safe. And here's where it gets even more layered. The calming effect of this exchange doesn't run in one direction. It runs in both. Studies on oxytocin, the bonding hormone released during close physical contact, show that both dogs and humans experience a measurable rise during grooming-type interaction. You settle. They settle. The more you are together in these moments, the stronger that neurological loop becomes between you. Some researchers have compared this mutual soothing dynamic to what happens between human caregivers and infants during skin-to-skin contact, a biological feedback loop that deepens with repetition. The loop closes, reinforces itself, and gets stronger every time. Quietly, without either of you fully realizing it. This is why your dog often licks you at exactly the moments that seem least convenient, when you're tired, distracted, or visibly upset. They're not misreading the room. They are reading it perfectly, and they're doing the only thing their biology tells them to do. But the timing of those licks isn't just a response to atmosphere in general. The research shows something far more specific than that. Now here's the part that genuinely changes how most people see their dog. And it starts with a study most people have never heard of. Researchers at the University of Lincoln ran a series of experiments testing whether dogs could recognize human emotional states across multiple sensory channels at once. Not just facial expressions, not just the tone of your voice, not just scent. All three, simultaneously, cross-referenced in real time. The result was clear. Dogs don't respond to a single cue. They integrate information from your face, your voice, and your body chemistry to form a complete picture. When you're stressed, your cortisol levels rise. That cortisol is released through sweat, breath, and subtle shifts in body temperature that happen automatically. Your dog is reading those signals before you say a single word. Before you've fully registered what you're feeling, they already know. And the research shows something very specific. Dogs lick more during these moments. Not the same. Not less. Measurably more. They're not licking you because they suddenly find you more interesting. They're licking because they've registered that you need something. Think about the last time you were quietly carrying something heavy, not dramatically, not obviously, just sitting somewhere with a weight you had named. And your dog walked over, sat beside you, started licking your hand slowly, without any clear reason that you could see. That wasn't coincidence. That wasn't them being clingy. That was your dog reading you more accurately than most people in your life ever do. They didn't need you to explain anything. They didn't need context or history or words. They just knew. This is called empathic response behavior in dogs, and it has been documented consistently across multiple independent studies over the past decade. It's not a metaphor. It's not anthropomorphism. It is measurable behavior tied directly to measurable biological input, your stress, their response. And the reason dogs are capable of this at all is directly tied to how they were shaped by 15,000 years of living beside us. Dogs that were better at reading human emotional states were more likely to be kept close, fed, and cared for. Over generations, that sensitivity wasn't just learned. It was selected for. The dogs who understood humans best were the ones who survived and stayed. What you're experiencing when your dog licks you during a hard moment isn't just warmth. It is the product of thousands of generations of mutual evolution. They were built to notice you, built to respond to you, built to do something about what they find when they look at you. But there is one more layer to this story. And it's the one that most owners are never told to watch for. Everything we've covered, the submission signal, the dopamine loop, the emotional reading, all of it traces back to the same source. 15,000 years ago, dogs and humans made an arrangement that neither species was fully conscious of entering into. Humans offered shelter, food, and safety. Dogs offered something that turned out to be far more valuable: attunement. They developed the ability to track human emotional states, respond to human signals, and regulate their own behavior in ways that kept them close to the people who mattered. Licking was part of that system from the very beginning. It bonded. It soothed. It communicated in ways that required no shared language. It still does. Every lick your dog gives you today is running the same ancient program that kept their ancestors alive and chosen. But here's what most people are never told. Licking can also be a signal running in the other direction from your dog to you about something that needs your attention. Excessive licking, repetitive, difficult to interrupt, focused obsessively on one area of your body or a single object, can be a sign your dog is not okay. Anxiety disorders in dogs frequently manifest through compulsive licking behaviors. If your dog licks relentlessly and seems unable to stop, it may not be affection. It may be a stress response that has become its own loop. And it may be worth a conversation with a veterinarian. There's also a pattern on the opposite end of the scale that fewer people know to notice. If your dog stops licking you, gradually over days or weeks, without any obvious change in the household, that absence can carry meaning. Dogs experiencing pain, depression, or early neurological decline often show a quiet withdrawal from social contact behaviors. Licking is frequently one of the first to fade. Researchers have found that approximately 35% of dogs over the age of 10 show a measurable reduction in social licking as one of the early behavioral indicators of cognitive decline. It doesn't happen suddenly. There's no single visible moment when something breaks. It's a slow, quiet fade, less greeting, less contact, less of what used to be constant. Most owners don't register it until much later. They assume the dog is simply aging, getting calmer, slowing down naturally. You might not be able to point to the day it changed, but at some level, you can feel when something is different. Sometimes that quiet fading is your dog telling you, in the only way they can, that something has shifted inside them. The same language that expresses trust and attunement at its peak can signal the loss of it when it begins to go silent. So the next time you notice your dog licking you, or notice that they haven't in a while, it's worth pausing for a moment longer than usual, because that tongue has never been about taste. It has always been about something much larger than that. So go back to that moment from the beginning. You're on the couch. It's the end of a long day. Your dog walks over, settles beside you, and starts licking your hand. Slow, steady, deliberate. You used to call it habit. You used to call it hunger or thirst, or just something dogs do without reason. Now you know what's actually happening. Your dog has already read you, your cortisol, your posture, the weight you're carrying tonight. They've determined that you need something. And they've come to do the one thing their entire evolutionary history has prepared them to do. They're acknowledging you. They're choosing you. They're running a 15,000-year-old program that says, I see you, and you are safe. The submission signal, the dopamine loop, the empathic read, the ancient arrangement between two species who decided to take care of each other. It's all there in one lick, in one slow, quiet moment on an ordinary evening that most people don't stop to think about. But it's also a reminder. Not every signal your dog sends you is easy to see. Not every shift in behavior is obvious. A dog that licks more than usual may be telling you something about their own anxiety that they have no other way to say. A dog that stops licking, gradually, quietly, may be one of the first signs that something has shifted in ways that deserve your attention. This language only works if you're paying attention to it. And now, at least, you know what you're listening for. The next time your dog licks you, really notice it. The timing, the pace, what was happening in the room just before they came over. They didn't just wander past. They came to you specifically because of something they noticed in you. That choice was not random. Not the floor. Not the couch. Not the stranger who passed the window this morning. You. That's not habit. That's not taste. That's your dog saying, in the only language they have, I see you. I'm here. And you are not alone. If this changed the way you think about your dog, subscribe. We're here every week going deeper into what's actually happening inside the animal who chose you. Drop a comment below. Does your dog lick you more when you're having a hard day? I genuinely want to know. And if you want to understand what your dog is saying when they stare at you in complete silence, that video is next. What's happening in that stare and why it works the way it does is one of the strangest things behavioral science has ever documented.